When you think about global politics, the relationship between the US and Russia is, well, it's a huge one. And for more than 200 years, it's been one of the most important and honestly one of the most confusing. We're talking about a story with some seriously wild swings, from being pretty close friends to staring down the barrel of nuclear war. So let's get into it and unpack this incredibly complex history. So that brings us to the big question, right? Are they friends or are they foes? I mean, which one is it? It's the question that's pretty much shaped global politics for, well, for generations. And the answer? It's not as simple as you'd think. It's actually really complicated. Because believe it or not, for over 200 years, the answer has been both. Yeah, both. The best way to picture it is like a giant pendulum. It just keeps swinging back and forth, from one extreme, cooperation, to the other, total confrontation. And today, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to follow that wild, dramatic swing. All right, let's kick things off at the very beginning with a part of the story that honestly might surprise you. We're talking about a long period of, well, unlikely friendship. Seriously, from the moment America was born all the way up to 1917, these two countries actually found a lot of common ground, mostly because they had a common rival, the old powers of Europe.
And if you look at these key moments, you can see one thing driving everything: pragmatism, pure and simple. Back in 1780, Russia recognized American independence, which was a huge deal for the young country. Then, get this, during the American Civil War, Russian fleets just showed up in New York and San Francisco. It was a clear signal to Britain and France basically saying, hey, back off. So why'd they do it? Simple. They both saw the old European empires as the real threat. This wasn't a friendship based on shared values. It was a partnership based on shared interests.
And speaking of that practical partnership, let's talk about this number, $7.2 million. That's it. That's all the United States paid for Alaska. It sounds crazy now, but for Russia, it was a smart strategic move. They figured, let's sell it to a friendly country to make sure the British can't get their hands on it. And for the US, it was an incredible deal that built a ton of trust and, massively expanded the country. So here's the key takeaway from this whole early period. You've got an imperial autocracy on one side and a brand new democracy on the other. I mean, ideologically, they couldn't have been more different. But for almost 150 years, that just didn't matter. They had an ocean separating them and common enemies in Europe. Being practical was just the smarter play. But then came 1917, and all of that practical, friendly-ish cooperation, it completely fell apart. The pendulum we talked about didn't just swing back, it flew violently in the opposite direction. The Bolshevik Revolution wasn't just a Russian event, it totally shattered that old friendship and kicked off an ideological war that would basically define the entire 20th century. And you can really see the massive divide here. All of a sudden, it wasn't about mutual interests anymore. It became a head-on collision of two completely different ways of seeing the world. On one side, you have American ideas like self-determination, capitalism, individual freedom. And on the other, you have Soviet ideology, all about class struggle and sparking a global communist revolution. There was just no way to reconcile the two. And President Woodrow Wilson's reaction? It summed up the American view perfectly. He called the new Soviet government a pariah state, a total outcast. The US even sent troops into Russia during its civil war. That's something the Soviets never, ever forgot. To them, it was a foreign invasion. The hostility was there right from the start, and it was intense. But then, history threw a curveball. A huge one. A common enemy forced that pendulum to swing back again. The rise of Nazi Germany made for some very strange bedfellows, creating a temporary, purely practical alliance. Let's be clear, this wasn't a return to the good old days. This was a desperate partnership just to survive. And when I say partnership, I mean it was on a staggering scale. The US sent more than $11 billion in aid to the Soviet Union. That's an incredible number for the time. We're talking trucks, planes, food, stuff that was absolutely essential for the Red Army to keep fighting on the Eastern Front. And let's not forget, that's where most of the fighting and dying happened for the Germans. But the second the war was over, poof, that alliance just vanished. And in 1946, Winston Churchill delivered this absolutely iconic phrase. And with it, the Cold War was unofficially on. The Iron Curtain, it wasn't just a great line. It was the new, harsh reality for a divided Europe and, really, a divided world. And for the next 40-plus years, the two superpowers were locked in this series of terrifying standoffs. You had the Berlin blockade, proxy wars in places like Korea and Afghanistan, and then the big one, the one that still gives people chills, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It's not an exaggeration to say the world was literally minutes away from all-out nuclear war. And this famous line from President Ronald Reagan in '83, this really shows you where things were at near the end. The evil empire. It doesn't get much clearer than that. He framed the whole conflict as a simple moral battle, good versus evil. This was sort of the final, super intense chapter of the hostility, right before the whole Soviet system started to come apart at the seams. So, 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. The whole world just kind of holds its breath. Is this it? Is the long fight over? Is this the start of a real, lasting partnership? Well, not quite. What we got instead was a kind of modern whiplash, these incredibly fast, volatile swings between trying to work together and then right back to confrontation. The 90s really did start with a lot of hope. The US was sending aid, Russia seemed to be moving towards democracy, but the cracks started showing almost right away. A huge one was NATO expansion. Russia saw that as a total betrayal of post-Cold War promises. Then you had major disagreements over Kosovo and the Iraq War. There was that famous reset button in 2009, but honestly, the distrust underneath it all was just too strong to overcome. And this is where that distrust really boiled over into open conflict. You can see a clear pattern emerging here, right? Russian military action, followed by a stronger and stronger US response each time. It started with condemnation after the war in Georgia in 2008. Then it ramped up to serious sanctions after Crimea was annexed in 2014. And that all led up to the massive global response we saw after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And that response can really be summed up with this one number: over $66.9 billion. That's just the US aid to Ukraine. When you add in the unprecedented global sanctions, it's pretty clear we've hit a new low point in the relationship. You could argue it's even more tense and complicated now than it was during the Cold War. But that pendulum, right? It never stays in one place for long. So let's shift to the present, or more accurately, a hypothetical near-future scenario that's based on some recent political trends. The idea here is that as we look at late 2025, we're starting to see some small signs that the momentum could be shifting yet again, away from all-out confrontation and maybe, just maybe, towards some kind of normalization. So, in the scenario that our source material projects, the political winds in the United States have changed. A new administration comes in and signals a pretty significant shift in strategy. The focus moves away from direct confrontation and more towards de-escalation. The goal? To start new talks with Russia and try to find an off-ramp from the current crisis. And you can see some of the specific hypothetical steps being taken. Things like a direct call between the two leaders to get peace talks going. Maybe a temporary pause on offensive aid to Ukraine just to create some breathing room for diplomacy. Even high-level summits to talk about really tough compromises like territorial concessions. Now, let's be real, the big issues don't just disappear. Sanctions would likely stay in place, and the core problems are still there. But opening up talks on other things, like Arctic energy, hints at a possible return to that old-school pragmatism. Which leaves us right back where we started, with the ultimate question. After almost 250 years of this wild ride, this pendulum swinging back and forth between friendship and hostility, between practical deals and near apocalypse, can this relationship ever just find a stable middle ground? Is a balance even possible? Or is it just destined to swing between these extremes forever? I guess the next few years might just give us the answer.